Let's begin right where the children's message left off, with a quote that kind of frames my entire talk. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to change. It's just not. For those of you who've read Dr. Seuss's 1971 book to your children or to yourself, or seen the more recent movie, you may recall that this modern parable, if you will, has kind of a single point, that phrase. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to change. It's just not. A single point. But wait a minute, there's a lot of other messages kind of buried in this book. Messages about the environment, about trees, about change, about unintended consequences, about stewardship, about responsibility. Things that we all want to reflect on as we heard the children's message, perhaps. This story, this Seuss parable, like the 46 other parables told by Jesus in the New Testament, embodies some fundamental ideas. Parables, you may recall, are memorable stories often taught with simple imagery, but each with a kind of a key message. Jesus, for example, likened the kingdom of God to yeast or to a mustard seed. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, also turned expectations on their head as the then despised Samaritan proved to be the wounded man's neighbor. Jesus' parables, like this story, were powerful and memorable, and they were strong enough that they survived in an oral tradition long years after Jesus' crucifixion. Sometimes they believe that some of these stories weren't written down for more than 150 years. But in this story, Seuss says, "I'm the Lorax, and I speak for trees. For trees have no tongues." So this morning we're going to try to give them some tongues. Now, I'm not going to repeat the details of the story because Virginia did an excellent job summarizing those details for the children. And the Lorax himself has been called at times a little bit controversially the gloomy parody of an environmentalist. But the truth be told, we are in the real world at risk of losing all the real-world barbaloots and swami swans and hummingfish and tuffla trees. They're threatened everywhere around the planet and the forests they inhabit. An example, for example, right here in this community is the loss and cutting of nearly 1,000 street trees, ash trees, which are threatened by the emerald ash borer, an invasive insect right here in Bowie. So within less than a few years, just virtually every one of those trees will be gone. Now, I've been working actively on green issues and the stewardship of our natural environment for decades, so make no mistake, we have plenty to be concerned about and much work to do on the environment. But as complicated, as intractable as these issues may seem, I think the next generation may be in a better position to meet those challenges. That generation of which my 10 grandchildren are a part of. Now, why I think that and how they can do that and how we can join and support them is what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this morning. You see, I've become convinced that my generation, like all generations, has become pretty confined by its own experience. We've become too vested in our own biases, too stuck in our ways to provide much of the new thinking that may be required in the future. I had a real revelation, frankly, in this past month as I was reflecting on these remarks this morning, because I recognized that I'm a part of the establishment against which everyone seems to complain these days. But as an old head, I hope that I've learned a few things. After all, I have sat through more than 2,500 sermons since I joined the United Methodist Church. So today, on Daniel's invitation and on reflection, I'd like to offer some suggestions about how leaders like you, particularly young leaders, can help shape our collective future and bend it in the direction of faith, freedom, and environmental responsibility. First of all, and this should be no problem for St. Matthew's folks, We have to be confident in our faith, confident in our commitment to God. Be confident in your Christianity. It's one of the great changes that has occurred in our country is the growing realization that there's no one way to be Christian. They come in all colors and all dimensions. Here in Bowie, for example, there are 72 Christian churches. Ironically, it's the same number of ball fields the city has, so everybody's got a play area. Now, among these 72 congregations are various ways to mark and celebrate and describe the significance of the one person called the Christ. People of faith are rich in diversity, but we can find, I believe, common ground. We can break stereotypes. We can build bridges of common community ministry, mainly because we can be confident in our faith in God and the example of Jesus' life and teachings, but not necessarily in the reproduction of our forms and rituals of worship on Sunday morning. There's going to be a great diversity there. So the first piece of advice is be confident in the love of God and his love for the planet that we inhabit. Second, however, as we each embrace our own religious tradition, we have to remember that that is not the tie that binds us as citizens or as an American. Each of us has our own particular awareness of our struggle with life. We can't afford to meet life, therefore, with a sense of entitlement. We can't see the homeless family without asking why a community as wealthy as ours or a nation as wealthy as ours allows that state of affairs to occur, or why violence is so rampant in our entertainment, or reports of it so common in our media. And that means we have to not only question the world as it is, we have to stand up for those who haven't been as fortunate as we are. Because, yes, we've worked, but we've also been fairly privileged. Many people don't seem to realize that a lot of their success isn't owed simply to something that they did. They've been lucky. God may have blessed us. It may have blessed you and me both, but it's not always something that we did. We fail to recognize often the role that fortune plays in our life. The philosopher Eric Hoffer once wrote, "The hardest arithmetic to master is that which enables us to count our blessings." For example, the family we were born into, the nation whose citizenship we enjoy. Those are easy and obvious examples for all of us. So we need to expand our imaginations to understand and empathize with people who are struggling, the immigrant, the refugee, the rural and urban poor, and members these days particularly of the LGBT community. And yes, many middle-aged and senior folks like ourselves who have had many advantages throughout life, such as accomplished parents, good schools, and confident employment, but particularly over the last decade have seen that world change a great deal and been upended by economic and social and technological change that many simply feel powerless to stop. It's phrased in almost every day's newspaper, particularly as we've read this past week. And that's led to widespread feelings of frustration and anger with the way things are. In my lifetime, the population of this nation has more than doubled. Since I moved to this community, its population has more than tripled, with attendant traffic congestion and a host of other challenges associated with the changing demographics of our community. Change will test us, but many seem to want more change, and change is coming. My third point is if these changes are to be positive, then we'll need more than just passion about something being different, our desire for change. We're going to need a strategy. We need passion, but as many of you know, we also need, if you know me very well, an agenda. Not just faith, but action. Not just faith, but a plan that can build engagement and allies and conversation around which to organize a conversation. You see, change requires more than simply belief and righteous anger with the way things are. It requires a program. It requires organizing. Awareness is not enough because in the final analysis, to make a difference may require changes in law, policy, program, behavior, and leadership. And in the case of the environment, our very daily habits, like how we deal with household waste. This community recently introduced recycling cartons. I'm sure you got one in front of your home. Big blue things that you put out once a week. About 80% of the waste stream that flows through our house is recyclable. And yet most residents here in Bowie put in less than half that. So we can do a great deal more in that area, just as a little example. But if we want to change examples, last fall, for example, in another situation, we had the occasion to hear our local police chief, John Neske. You may recall he came to talk with us about local public safety. But then the question comes up is, do you know who our local Prince George's State's Attorney is? Do you know who our state's Attorney General is? Is there a difference? Do you know who appoints John Neske? Do you know who writes the training manual that guides the way he administers justice in this community? And by the way, do citizens even have a role in that process? Are they consulted about it? If we change the topic from public safety and the environment to recycling, what about community social services? What does Bowie provide? What does the county provide? And what are the difference in their responsibilities? And if we want to see change, perhaps we ought to have a community conversation about this division in our midst. We need engagement of the faith community in that process so that we can present for our community a plan to our community's leadership. If we want to bring about change, like for example the provision of more social services in the older parts of our community, then we need a better plan on how to go about that, and we need to present that to our local leaders and hold them accountable. And if they don't deliver, ask them some tough questions about how they performed. Commitment is vital, but you've got to have a plan. You've got to have a strategy. And by the way, your plan better include voting. Now, not just sometime, but all the time. Now, personally, I think there's too much conversation about putting up barriers to voting. But even if we dismantled every barrier to voting, that alone would not change the fact that our country and this community has some of the lowest voting rate participations in the world. Just last year, 2015, in our last city election, last November, only 17% of our registered voters cast ballots. About 6,700 folks out of more than 40,000 registered in this community. And most of those voted in only the 3 at-large contests. Of the 4 district council members, they were elected by less than 1,400 votes. As a matter of fact, 3 of them were elected by less than 1,000 votes. That means that less than 7% of those eligible to vote actually showed up either before, during, or on Election Day. That's hardly more than the active members of this particular congregation. In 2014, just the last federal election, only about 1/3 of the nation's electorate turned out to vote in those midterm elections. The second lowest participation rate on record, that is in over 200 years. Now, don't you think that made a difference in the kind of Congress we have today? Don't you think it made a difference in the kind of council we have today? You know, people wonder why things don't get done, or they want to complain about Congress, or why the president doesn't get things done. Well, don't you think turnout makes a difference? Who shows up to actually vote for these folks? What would have happened if 40, 50, or even 60% or more participated in the national election? Do you know that it's been nearly 60 years since more than 60% of the American people turned out at the federal level for any election? That was the year John Kennedy and Richard Nixon went to it. And in this community, We've never topped 25%. Now, people try to make elections real complicated. Personally, I think reforms are needed in the Electoral College. But if we want any kind of change at all, we've got to get out and vote. And as one observer put it, if you have more votes than the other guy, you get to do what you want to do, or you get to stop the other guy from doing what he wants to do. Remember, if you don't vote, you disenfranchise yourself. We need to use the power of the ballot to focus our energies to protect the environment and the rights of the more vulnerable citizens than we are. But ultimately, we have to show up, and we have to inform ourselves and not just vote once or twice, but vote every time, not just when it's a hot contest, not just when it's time to elect the president, not just when you're inspired or repelled by a particular candidate. Think of it as a duty, a civic duty. And that's how we change politics, by electing people at every level, from the city council to the president of the United States, who are representative of and accountable to us. So we have to vote. We have to inform ourselves. Democracy and passion must be tempered by reason and information. And finally, change requires more than just speaking out. It requires listening. In particular, it requires listening to those folks with whom you disagree and being prepared to reframe the debate and discussion, to look for common ground with those folks. When I became mayor, I found that for 17 years, the city had asked, demanded, and lobbied the county and the local school board to build an auditorium for Bowie Senior High School. We wanted it for school plays, assemblies, and activities. For 17 years, those efforts had failed. And so we engaged, and we listened, and we kept working to build a new consensus. And because we took time to listen, we crafted a proposal that had the trust and cooperation of the community and that met its needs. And the result is the Bowie Center for the Performing Arts, built by the city in cooperation with the state and the county, and, oh yes, it doubles as a high school auditorium. Still meets that basic need. The point is, you have to have a plan. You have to have allies, and it can be very frustrating. It can even be slow. 17 years is really slow, but history teaches us that the alternative is always worse. And that's not just true in this country or in this community. As many have pointed out, go to any country in the world where the give and take of democracy has been repealed, and you'll find a country today that does not work. And democracy itself is on trial around the world these days. The hardest lesson that I ever had to learn as an elected official was that the perfect was the enemy of the good. Now that's true in communities, nations, and churches. Democracy requires compromise, even when you think you're 100% right. Now that's hard to understand for many of us. You can be confident in your views, and you're still going to have to engage with those folks who disagree with you. Now you can think the only way forward is to stand on your principles. After all, I know what's best. But frankly, you're simply not going to get what you want. And if 17 years isn't a local lesson, you need only look at the national one right now for the last dozen. And if you don't get what you want long enough, you eventually begin to think that the whole system is rigged, and it'll lead to cynicism and even less participation and the downward spiral of anger and more cynicism where many people find themselves today. And that's never been a source of progress in the community or the nation. The perfect, my way, is the enemy of the good. I was recently reminded as I watched the television play All the Way that Dr. Martin Luther King and his Soren Reddick, which we often remember, and the marches that preceded and followed that were kind of masked by the fact that Dr. King sat down with President Johnson to work for the Civil Rights Act, and later for the Voting Rights Act, and finally for the Public Accommodations and the Fair Housing Act that led to the desegregation of this community. These mileposts in our progress, as we're now finding out in constant public discussion, weren't perfect, but they made things better. I've always liked a quote I heard in high school and used it quite frequently: good, better, best. Never let it rest till the good is better and the better is best. Better's good. Better's good because it helps us consolidate our gains. And then you can move on to the next issue in a stronger position. Our community, like the church and America itself, is more diverse than ever. And with so many folks from so many places trying to figure out a way, we're not always going to agree with each other. The author Zora Neale Hurston, in a book that many of you studied in high school called Their Eyes Were Watching God, gave us an interesting quote: "Nothing that God ever made is the same thing for more than one person." Think about that. Nothing that God ever made is the same thing for more than one person. So we have to listen, engage, and if the other side has a point, we have to learn from them. If they're wrong, we have to rebut them, teach them, meet them, beat them on the battlefield of ideas, and you might as well start practicing that now. For one thing you can be confident of: in addition to the good folks that you and I try to hang out with, we're going to find ignorance, hatred, intolerance, and troubling folks at every stage of life. Now, that may not be fair, but whoever said life was completely fair? And if you want to make life fair, then we all have to start with a world we never made. Just like Justice Learned Hand said, we all began with a world we never made. But frankly, that's the way things change. Change isn't placing your faith in one particular leader and then sitting back and say, okay, do it. Change is an effort of committed citizens like yourselves, who hitch yourselves to ideas and ideals bigger than themselves and work for them every day at every level of government and responsibility that you are engaged in. In today's book by Dr. Seuss, he writes that the Lorax, as Virginia quoted, disappears at one point behind some smoggy clouds. For those of you who didn't read the book, there's the picture. And a small monument appears bearing a single word: unless. James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Now, each of us is here because someone else faced down challenges for us. We are only who we are because someone else struggled and sacrificed for us. That's the biblical story. That's Christ's story and the struggle and sacrifices he made for us, but it is a unique, also American story. And frankly, it's the story of the Lorax. Now, when that journey seems too hard, when you run into a chorus of cynics who tell you that you're just being foolish to keep believing that you can't do something, or that you should just settle for the way things are, you might say to yourself a little phrase taken from the Lorax: unless someone like you cares a whole lot, nothing's going to change. It's not. Because, in the final analysis, if we get the new picture, change is coming.